Liu Changqing, farewell to the Reverend Fang Wai. A lonely cloud sees off the wild crane. How could you stay in the world of men? But crane, don't buy a mountain spot in Guozhou. Word has spread about how great it is. So we have the last poem of Liu Changqing in this anthology and in this section. Pretty fittingly, the last poem, like most of the ones he has in this collection, is a farewell poem. I would say it's a slightly peculiar farewell poem in that it doesn't dwell on the typical emotional condition and topics that appear in this sort of poetry, which is mostly lachrymose. It's generally a really felt or a socially conventional expression of sadness at the separation of a person from a friend. And in this case, we actually don't get anything of that. Really, this poem has what might be perceived as a slightly teasing, humoristic type of tone. So it reworks the topic in a slightly original way, I would say. So first of all, the context. So like in previous poems, probably similar to the context of Farewell to Priest Ling Che, we have here the poetic persona of Liu Changqing saying goodbye to a Buddhist priest or monk with whom he has been enjoying probably some time together, cultural conversation and cultural activities. The Reverend is going to leave now, probably for a retired life. Maybe he doesn't belong to a specific monastery, so he is going away. And these are the words, this is the gift of words, the bouquet of words that Liu Changqing composes to see his friend off. So, as we said, the topic of the poem is parting, but the emphasis really is not so much on the suffering or the pains of parting, it's rather on, well, there is an element of leaving the world, of the virtues of leaving the world, but there's also a comical aspect embedded in this, the virtues of the retired life. And there's also an implication that we will comment when we talk about the second couplet, about the fact that some of these retreats from the world by Taoist sages or Buddhist monks were not really retreats from the world, as important Buddhist monasteries or Taoist temples remained in contact with the world, with the imperial court and with important patrons. And, sometimes living in those places actually served as a springboard for important positions in connection with the imperial household or the imperial administration. Which is something that, slightly ironically, this poem seems to be warning about as a possibility. Okay, so first couplet. A lonely cloud sees off the wild crane. How could you stay in the world of man? So the first poem, the first couplet opens with this. Most of the poem, except for the first line, is at least in this version, in Geoffrey Waters' translation, is conceived as the response of a lonely cloud to a wild crane. So here, both creatures, the wild crane and the lonely cloud, are meant to stand in for the two persons who appear from the title of this poem: the poetic persona, who is described as a lonely cloud, and the Reverend Fang Wai, who is metaphorized into this wild crane. The images, we've encountered them before, and they're pretty significant. So, lonely clouds were typical expressions used for hermits or for Buddhist monks, people living aside from the world, not tied to this world, sometimes even used by scholar officials for themselves, especially when they were felt or when they felt themselves to be uprooted from ties to court or to any specific location. So Liu Changqing paints himself as this type of lonely cloud. The Reverend is a wild crane. Now, wild cranes are associated with immortality. I think we've also encountered a few poems where they appeared as such. That's one of the reasons also why some of the towers, like Yellow Crane Tower, are associated with cranes. There's this belief, especially in Taoist mythology, that once an individual has through different religious and other dietary and other sorts of practices, has managed to become an immortal, a lot of the time he or she just flies away to a crane that comes from heaven and goes on to live in the ether or in some Taoist paradise. So wild cranes are pretty frequently used as a symbol for immortality or for Taoist sages, or humans that manage to escape the shackles of the world. So this idea, a lonely cloud talking with a wild crane, it fits the bill. It sounds like a proper metaphor and a proper semi-fictional context for the dialogue. And very appropriately, the lonely cloud tells the wild crane, how could you stay in the world of men? I mean, you are a wild crane, you soar up into the skies. It does not make sense for you to live in the world of men. So we have these two levels. There's the literal level, but I imagine this literal level is supposed to be read metaphorically. So both the poetic persona and his monk friend adopt this guise of cranes and clouds, and the flight of the crane leaving the world is associated with the impossibility of on the part of the monk to continue to dabble in the lower material egoistic world, court and ambition. We've talked many times that Chinese is very elusive, especially classical Chinese, when it comes to tense, to pronoun. So that has led to different translations of this couplet, actually. So in one of the translations that I've seen, instead of it being a lonely cloud and a wild crane or having a dialogue, the poem starts as something like, clouds or lonely clouds, wild cranes can't stay in the world of men. So in that context, the two entities would be standing in as images, as metaphors for the Reverend Fang Wai, instead of one being the poet and the other being Fang Wai. Now moving on to the second couplet, which would be a direct continuation of the lonely clouds, that is the poet's speech. The second line, after the poet has expressed that you can't stay in the world of men, the second line includes a bit of a warning, which I imagine is meant to be taken slightly comedic, or more than slightly comedic. But crane, don't buy a mountain spot in Wuzhou. Word has spread about how great it is. So mixing these elements of the fictional posturing of crane and clouds with the literal of poet and monk, Liu Changqing gives an advice to his monk friend. But crane, don't buy a mountain spot in Wuzhou. Wuzhou was, I think, one of an important Buddhist precinct in the area of modern-day Zhejiang, in the eastern coast of China. Like many mountain precincts in imperial China, it was an area that was studded with temples, both Taoist and Buddhist. So it was an important spot for many temples. And this connects with what I was telling you earlier. So an important monastic complex in Wuzhou would not have been really completely detached from the world. That is, many of its monks would have been very cultured. Many important scholar officials and patrons might visit the monastery and establish relationships with the more cultured monks. And these cultured monks, instead of being really cut away from the world and dedicated to meditation and to achievement of samsara, many of these monks would have maintained epistolary relations with aristocrats and scholar officials, perhaps even with the imperial court itself. And famous monks in a famous monastery might achieve enough prestige to be summoned by the imperial court as, chaplains or for the heading of important Buddhist temples in the capital. So in that respect, going to one of these important Buddhist complexes would be far from renouncing the world and a different, oblique and devious way of triumphing in the material world. And this possibility seems to be hinted at and joked at in this poem. So the crane is told not to buy a mountain spot in Wuzhou. Word has spread about how great it is. It is very popular, This is the Tang Dynasty equivalent to the touristification of Venice or Benidorm or San Shensho or Santiago. So, too many people are going there. It has become a worldly place instead of a supernatural and religious place. so better not to go there. In fact, the third line, using this image of buying, I think the original says buy the mountain, doesn't specifically detail buying a spot. And I've also seen that this image of buying the mountain has confused a lot of some translators that I've consulted. So buying a mountain spot, I imagine if you were a Buddhist monk going to Warsaw, you wouldn't buy a spot literally. I mean, you would either join a monastery or perhaps establish a hermitage in some empty spot of the mountain. The image of telling the crane not to buy a spot, so the use of a verb associated with buying and selling is probably, perhaps in this part of this ironic making fun of monks who might be pursuing fame and glory in the disguise of renounce in the world, which he probably does not feel Reverend Fang Wai sincerely is going to do, because otherwise this poem wouldn't really, it would be offensive. It wouldn't really have any sense. But there's this warning. If we could summarize the whole poem or paraphrase it into common speech, he says, "Hey, my friend, you're like a wild crane. You're one of these wise men who want to renounce the glories of the world, who can continue it. But careful, careful. Don't just go to one of these famous Buddhist monasteries, because there you will have as much of the world and its ambitions as you have here." So, interesting piece, and as I said, I like especially the freshness of this slightly comedic and I wouldn't call it subversive, but unusual take on a parting poem on the part of Liu Changqing.